How are you doing, Album Wang? A while back, I uploaded the Cactus to Clouds to Cactus videos, and someone asked, what did I use to navigate? I wasn't sure what the viewer was referring to because I simply looked up the directions and went ahead. But I did some research. Apparently, this was one of the main issues people commonly brought up. So for this third video in the series, we're gonna examine navigating Cactus to Clouds. There are a few points to clarify. This video is not to provide you turn-by-turn directions, because those are rather easy to find out. Instead, I will focus on specific navigation issues and related advice. There's one confusing junction that I'll explain, and that's going to be the closest to giving you some kind of directions. This won't touch on using GPS, or more specifically, following a downloaded GPS track. I don't consider that to be knowing how to actually navigate in the wild. And the final disclaimer is obviously the video applies to normal conditions only. Let's assume it's a clear day and there are no unexpected obstacles or trail closures, for example. Okay, so just briefly about me, my qualifications. I've completed Cactus to Clouds back to Cactus twice. And of course, I have the full-length footage from the second time. I also read reviews and guides from the past couple of years and watch any latest hikers video on this. Additionally, I was in the area recently and decided to hike the entire Skyline Trail up and down just to see what was new and to get myself reacquainted. Alright, as the video zooms down to Southern California, I'll give a general description. Cactus to Clouds is what I consider an extreme hiking challenge. Hikers are going from the city of Palm Springs all the way to the summit of San Jacinto Peak. And obviously, it's not the standard route, which is to hike up from Idlewild on the other side of the mountain. But back to our extreme challenge. The total elevation gain is about 10,368 feet, and that's just the difference between Palm Springs and the summit, not including a few brief but notable downhill sections. The trailhead, which starts behind the Art Museum, is at elevation 466 feet, while the summit rises to 10,834 feet. One-way distance is around 15.7 miles, with the total distance varying based on how one goes back down. Usually, after the summit, most people will choose to descend only to the upper aerial tram terminal, which they'll take and make the total hiking distance 21.8 miles. A few do descend all the way back down to Palm Springs, which is Cactus to Clouds to Cactus, and in total hiking 31.4 miles. Okay, in terms of navigating Cactus to Clouds, it's best to split it into two separate sections. There are the top 6.2 miles, where it's easy to know which way to take because the trails are clearly signed and mapped. And then the bottom 9.5 miles from Palm Springs up to Long Valley. This section is where most people are concerned about. I'll quickly explain the easier top section so that we can move on to the main topics of this video. After hiking 9.5 miles up from Palm Springs, one will arrive in Long Valley. It's where the ranger station and the upper tram terminal are. Because of that infrastructure, hikers can expect maintained trails with a lot of directional signage. and even a nice map to use from the state park's website. There's really just one place where any navigation is actually needed, and that's the last 1/10 of a mile from the emergency stone hut to the summit, where you're dealing with a boulder field, a lot of class 2 to 3 scrambling, but it's hard to get lost due to the short distance, and you just go up until you can't anymore. There's a summit sign that I believe is there all the time, possibly, and 3 benchmarks to look for. Okay, now that's done. We can move on to the main concern, which is the lower 9.5 miles. As I've stated, that's what's recognized as the Skyline Trail, going from Palm Springs, the trailhead, up to Long Valley. It's unofficial but maintained by local volunteers. In order to help you to be successful, I'll explain 3 navigation-related subjects: the obstacles, my tips or best practices, and finally, the landmarks. Okay, we'll start with the obstacles, and I'm going to cover them generally according to when they appear on the route, from bottom to top. The first obstacle is going through private property, which is not an actual obstacle, but more like how the trail is designed. And it's just the first 100 yards where hikers are asked to stay on trail and not veer off. After going past the driveway, then it's no longer private property. Next, we have the infamous shortcuts, which I believe are the most common type of obstacles to come across. They'll appear very early from the start, throughout, up to Long Valley. But during the first mile up to the picnic tables, the shortcuts may not cause any major problems, largely due to navigation aids being present and essentially your close proximity to the city if needing help. It's mainly when you're higher up, where the surroundings are kind of monotonous. That's when getting lost from using a shortcut may lead to a more serious situation. It isn't difficult to distinguish between shortcuts and the main trail. A shortcut is usually steeper, narrower, and more direct. Of course, the main Skyline Trail is also steep, but it's definitely more forgiving. It has gentler bends and switchbacks, plus being wider and less rugged most of the time compared to the shortcuts. Of course, there are numerous reasons why we don't want to use shortcuts. For example, to prevent erosion, the shortcuts themselves can be steep and dangerous, and ethically, it's cheating. But because this is a navigation video, I'm gonna demonstrate a couple of ways showing why it's easy to become lost if using a shortcut. So this first graphic shows what most people think a typical shortcut looks like. In this case, it's straightforward. The shortcut is skipping a switchback, thus making the trip shorter and quicker. But there could be a situation like this second graphic, where after taking the shortcut, one could think that going up would be to turn right, which could lead to that hiker going round and round, like in those circus shows. Well, hopefully, the individual would eventually figure it out and turn left to continue. However, imagine this scenario. We can see that although both trails are heading up, the correct trail is the higher one. But the shortcut is connecting only to the lower incorrect trail, and it's evident what may happen. Okay, that was my big emphasis on the shortcuts, because as I said, they would be the most plentiful of the navigation obstacles to be encountered. Next, we have the one official intersection on the Skyline Trail that I'll give directions for. I want to say Lichen, but I believe it's pronounced Lichen, North Lichen Trail. If it's not Lichen, then I'll just sound like a dumbass for the next minute. Anyhow, here you can see what the junction looks like per a map at the trailhead. The satellite view from Google Maps. And an interactive map by Palm Springs. Obviously, this third version doesn't show the upper right connector, the northeast connector, which I'll admit makes the most sense to me of how I think a usual junction looks like. But I'm neither a map maker nor a trail builder, so I'll refrain from further comments. But navigating through this area is really simple. From the picnic tables, go straight to the large cairn or rock pile. Turn right there. Skip the shortcut that appears on the left. Go up a bit more and turn left to continue. Alright, the dead ends, which a majority of hikers dislike. Well, there's good news because the dead ends, the ones I've been able to find on the Skyline Trail, they usually don't last for long, and there aren't actually many of them. The latter is thanks to local volunteers doing a good job of marking the dead ends simply by placing objects on the ground so that hikers can see and don't mistakenly wander onto them. Of course, dead ends can sound scary, but they're rather simplistic to overcome. Just backtrack the same way. I'll show you these two examples. This first dead end lasts maybe 30 to 40 yards only, and it disappears into a ravine. And this second one stops quickly after 10 yards. Once you've ascended high enough from the desert below, more and more plants will start to show, which may create navigation problems if they're overgrown and blocking the trail. But I should disclose that the first couple of times I did this many years ago, there were many places where I dealt with overgrown vegetation. But on my recent Skyline Trail hike at the end of 2024, I didn't encounter a single spot where plants were completely obscuring the path. Again, that should be due to the amazing local volunteers cleaning the trail. This photo was probably the closest I came to dealing with anything overgrown on the trail. But there was still a clear but narrow pathway through the shrubs. So, unlike the shortcuts mentioned earlier, a split is when the main trail separates into two or more about equally feasible route choices to consider using. Often, this is to avoid an obstacle, such as a body of water in the way. However, Having personally gone through the Skyline Trail 6 times now, I can safely declare that it doesn't have any real trail splits. All of the grades referenced by other hikers in their reports are really shortcuts that's been used so frequently that they become a lot wider and look like the main Skyline Trail. There is one place where I may consider to be a true trail split, which is when you see this head wall. I believe this is the third head wall on the route, where there are 2 paths going upper left and upper right, and they're both nearly equal in terms of effort and distance. Either option can be used to progress. Another obstacle type is fallen trees, which of course won't enter the picture until you've gained enough elevation to where tall trees can grow, which is generally from flat rock and higher. A large enough fallen tree could temporarily hide the trail from your view. But if you got closer and looked around, you would certainly find the trail continuing just beyond. The last obstacle I wanted to talk about was the cairns, and yes, I realized that it might be controversial to consider them as unhelpful for navigating. However, everyone should realize that the only cairns which could safely be used for navigation were the ones officially established, such as by rangers. Or you could make note of cairns that been known over a long period of time and referenced in many sources. But I personally wouldn't 100% rely on those as checkpoints on my route, just as a good safety habit. Anyway, when attempting the Skyline Trail, it should be rare for you to see cairns, and they wouldn't likely appear until the upper reaches near Long Valley, around where the traverse was. To emphasize again how bad random cairns are for navigating, have a look at this example. There was a cairn at this spot during my second attempt in 2021, and I didn't because I knew where the actual trail was, up on the left. But if I were to follow this cairn, which kinda hinted to go straight, I would then have to deal with a steep and hazardous social trail to get back to the main Skyline route, which I discovered from my initial scouting trip. But during my recent Skyline Trail hike, this cairn was no longer there, which was a good thing. Alright, now that you know the things that can lead to the wrong way, I'll give you some of my advice to stay on the correct path. These tips are all equally important, but if we're picking one to be top priority to keep in mind, you just need to understand that there's always a trail to follow. Although the Skyline Trail is indeed a used trail, there are volunteers doing maintenance and trail cleaning. Which is to say, you can always easily follow a clear path and never supposed to be bushwhacking through thick vegetation or trailless cross-country route finding. If you find the trail disappearing for a notable distance, you probably have gone through a dead end, and need to backtrack to the main trail. Okay, this tip sounds basic, but I believe it's so basic that sometimes people forget that the Skyline Trail is a really steep trail, gaining 8,000 feet in less than 10 miles. Which means one is heading up almost the entire time. I do count about 6 places where the trail does become downhill. Fortunately, those sections don't last long, nowhere near a mile for any of them. And it's always clear that the Skyline Trail itself is losing some elevation. Basically, if you find yourself heading downhill for a while, it's highly probable that you're going the wrong way. Okay, I realize Cactus to Clouds is an incredible task for a to-do list, but considering the enormous population in the region, it's no surprise to me that this gets attempted all the time. And that's evident based on hikers' reports found online. So another common sense method to stay on the correct route is to look for shoe prints. It's near certain one will find a lot of prints tracking the entire Skyline Trail. And to mirror my previous tips, if you don't see any prints for a while, you are probably not on the main route. Okay, some of the shortcuts are becoming wider due to overuse, but the Skyline Trail should still be the widest much of the time. And it's not just shortcuts and dead ends, but other used trails may exist, although I don't recall seeing any, or at least any that's as distinctive as the Skyline Trail. Okay, here's my last tip before we move on to the landmarks. You can never see the true summit, but you can always see and understand what's above. Mainly due to the sparse vegetation at the lower elevations and generally short vegetation throughout. Here's what the actual skyline looks like for about the first 3,000 feet, and it's just a red ridge to gain. Once above darker red desert terrain, the scenery turns lighter and greener. So here's the next skyline, which is another ridge. I don't have the exact elevation reading, but I want to say around halfway. One can start aiming for the Upper Jam Station and Cupman's Crack. To conclude this video segment, it's important to remember that there's supposed to always be a trail to follow, which is steep uphill, usually wider. There are gonna be existing prints, and it's possible to see what's up above to aim for. Okay, everyone, we've gotten to the third chunk of this video, the landmarks. Similar to the obstacles previously, I'm gonna go over these according to when they appear, from the trailhead up to Long Valley. These are kind of well known to hikers who've completed Cactus to Clouds. I want to say they are probably about as famous as the whole challenge itself. I will cover only the more prominent landmarks or features that won't likely be gone or missing anytime soon. And know that all of the lower landmarks will be human-made, and only the top two are natural, due to the homogeneous desert at lower elevations, making it difficult to identify and remember unique features in the terrain. Okay, the first thing one will probably notice is the white dot blazes. Just a few notes to know about them. They are really abundant on the first mile up to the picnic tables, and they kinda mostly disappear after which. They are meant for navigating and staying on the correct trail. It's been reported by a few sources that at night the paint is supposed to be reflective when shined on by a light. That's not true, and I can confirm firsthand. It's just that the color is white, so it's kind of bright and shiny. And realize that the blazes appear in both directions. Not made specifically for Cactus to Clouds ascenders. I've mentioned the next landmark numerous times throughout this video, which is the picnic tables. About 1 mile in and 1,000 feet up. To the modern hikers, they've always been there. Right before the next landmark to encounter, which is the North Licking Trail Junction. And I've already gone over how to navigate through this junction as an earlier obstacle in this video. Next come the two emergency boxes, which are known as Rescue 1 and Rescue 2 by the Cactus to Clouds community. And don't expect anything to be inside these. The first box, Rescue 1, is over 2 miles in at around 24 or 2500 foot elevation. And Rescue 2 is over 6 miles in at around 5500 foot elevation. Of course, the stuff inside is only for emergency use, and it's encouraged to leave extra items if you have any to spare. Okay, much higher up from the museum trailhead, at around 6,000 feet and nearly 8 miles into the route, one will arrive at a distinctive location commonly called Flat Rock. This is what it looks like. It's also the informal start of hiking through a lot of manzanita plants, and the steepest last 2 miles before Long Valley. We're almost there, but before getting into Long Valley via a saddle known as Grubb's Notch, there's one more notable natural landmark to be alert for. It's Kaufman's Crack, which will gradually appear through openings in the trees. Eventually, you'll be right under it and continue to ascend much higher than it. Okay, we're nearly at the end of this video. As always, here's my wise summary. There are many obstacles to confuse Cactus to Clouds hikers. With the most common being the shortcuts. Just pay attention to those and know how to spot the main skyline trail based on my tips. Which I'd suggest the most important one was to remember that there should always be a trail to follow. You wouldn't be doing any real scrambling or route finding until the very top summit area. Another wise thing to do is to track the landmarks, maybe as checkpoints for your journey. So, knowing the obstacles, my shared tips, and the landmarks, all together, they may just help you successfully navigate Cactus to Clouds. As well, there are common sense strategies to apply to all of your future endeavors. See you out on the trails. Aw. By the way, of course I have full-length videos. You can check them out under the California playlist.